This is Susie Penman here with my colleague Brian Franklin. Today is December 11th, 2024, and we are here in Dallas on SMU's campus, and we are interviewing Dr. Jeffrey Engel for the Oral History of Walter LaFeber project. So can you begin by introducing yourself, telling us a little bit about who you are?
Sure. I am the founding director of the Center for Presidential History here at SMU. It's been up and running 12 and a half years, 13 years now. I am a very, very proud Cornell alum from class of 1995, which gets more and more disturbing to say. And Walter LaFeber was my advisor in college. He was my mentor. I look to him in a very grandfatherly way. I'll try not to tear up during this interview. And truly one of the great absolute blessings of my life, completely unexpected, which I'm happy to talk about more, was the fact that I had the opportunity to learn from him. And learn from him, not just history, but learn from him as an example.
So tell us about the moment, if you can recall, when you first met or encountered Walter LaFeber.
Yeah, well, that's the blessed part. So I always wanted to be a historian. I always wanted to study history. I went to college and took a bunch of pre-med courses because I have a Jewish mother, and that's what one is supposed to do. But I always wanted to be a historian, and therefore, my first semester of freshman year, I remember talking to the graduate student who was teaching my writing seminar, what other courses sound interesting? And he got out the list of courses and was going down and describing the different professors and what they taught. By the way, that was very enlightening to me because I had no idea there were all these different kinds of history, like, labor history. I didn't know that was a thing. Women's history, I didn't know that was a thing. Like, I thought all history was how nations fight with each other. Isn't that what history is? And he stopped when he got to LaFeber's name and said, that guy's really the most famous and important one. He's the one that people listen to. And then he just moved on, and that always stuck in the back of my mind. And I mention that because when I went to college, I had no idea that he existed. That I wanted to be a history major, but the colleges I was looking at, you could get an undergraduate history degree at any of those places. They were all fine. So, in fact, I remember standing on the bridge connecting main campus to College Town, which anybody who's been to Cornell knows exactly where I'm talking about, with my father when I was 18, and we were doing campus tour, and we only looked at schools I had been accepted to. And I grew up in Nebraska, so I didn't know a lot of the East Coast tropes, if you will. And I turned to my dad and said, I really like this place. Like, is it okay? Is it good enough? And he said, yeah, it's fine. So I did not choose Cornell because LaFeber was there. So God really shined on me by saying, yeah, I'm going to put you in a place where the thing you actually want to study, unbeknownst to you, the best person in the country is already there. So that's how I first heard of him.
And you took his class that semester?
No, I went into his office that semester. This is a good story. I went into his office that semester and said, I want to declare as a history major. It's important to note that I was in the midst of an emotional and psychological crisis at that point because the aforementioned pre-med classes weren't working out well for me. Organic chemistry did not suit me. And I was wanting to sort of in the next semester, in the spring semester, jump into something that I really wanted to study in hopes I would do better. And I thankfully did. So I went and said, I want you to be my advisor. And he very politely said, no, because you're a freshman and we don't allow freshmen in our department to, it's just a matter of policy, or practice, I should say. We don't allow freshmen to, choose an advisor and declare a major, but, stop by any time, So next year I took his course. So that would have been beginning of my sophomore year, History 313, American Foreign Policy, 1750 to whenever. I don't remember exactly when they stopped. I think it might actually been 1913. And it was brilliant, of course. And I went to him and said, I'm in your class. I really want to do something more. I really want to, learn something more. And he said, what are you interested in? What do you do? We talked about this for a while. I made the mistake of mentioning that I had studied French. My French was even worse than my organic chemistry. So he said, oh, well, you should do Franco-American relations. There's all kinds of interesting stuff on that. You can read original sources, et cetera, et cetera. By the way, there's this really interesting guy, Frank Costigli something. I couldn't get the name right. Some weird Italian name. That's around here who just wrote a book on that. You should get to know him. He's bopping around from time to time. And that's obviously Frank Costigliola, for those of you who didn't get the reference. And he said, here's 5 or 6 books. I want you to read these and, come back and talk about them. And I did, and I came back and talked about them, and we talked about it more, and we talked about frequently. By the end of the semester, he actually said to me, of his own volition, he said, are you getting any credits for this? And I said, no, I thought you went to college to learn stuff. I have my classes, but I'm also interested in learning stuff. And again, I had no idea how important he was on campus. So he writes out like a little 3 lines on a piece of paper and hands it to me and says, go to the registrar. And I show up at the registrar and I said, my professor says I should be getting an independent study credit. And this is probably mid-November. And the registrar counter person said, oh, you missed the deadline like months ago. And I said, well, I've got this note. And she opens it up. She goes, oh, Professor LaFeber. Okay, we'll make that happen. Long-ish story short, I subsequently learned that this was part of his method. That when people would come in and say, I want to study something, he would say, sure, that sounds great. What are you interested in? Let's find some books, give you some books. And 95% of those people he never saw again. Because, you mean I actually have to do extra work to learn something? That's not my style. It's the average response. And I came back. And that summer, between my sophomore and junior year, we put together a National Endowment for the Humanities grant. It's unfortunately a program that doesn't exist anymore for undergraduates who think they might want to do research to, have a go at it over a summer. I think it was $1,800 for the whole summer. And worked on Franco-American relations more while I worked on campus over the summer. So that was really the genesis of how I bonded to him, if you will. Attached myself to him is probably the better way to put it.
Mm-hmm. I'm just curious, can you remember what his office looked like?
Yeah.
What was it like to go and sit in there with him?
So this is actually a good question for me, because which is to say, I've asked myself this question. When I got there in 1991, he was already transitioning to semi-retirement. Maybe semi-retirement's not the right term, but not full-time teaching anymore. He was clearly much closer to the end of his career than the beginning. And I say that because I've always wondered why this really prestigious, important guy shared an office with somebody. Because, clearly he ranked his own office. And there were individual offices in that building. It's a nice building. It's exactly the kind of building, McGraw Hall is exactly the kind of building a history department should be in. It's old, it's fallen apart. It's got lots of nooks and crannies. It's exactly right. So I don't know if in previous iterations of his career he had had his own office. But when I knew him, he shared an office with Joel Silby, who was a 19th century historian. The two of them, I suspect, had a lot of curmudgeonly chats with each other whenever students would leave about what had just happened. And his office was very full of books and a lot of Cubs paraphernalia and a lot of sort of historical knickknacks. And the most important thing to know about his office is there was always a line to get in. This is something I think students have lost today when they make appointments via email or via text to meet with you. Professors used to have office hours. They were set at a certain time. And if you want to talk to a professor, especially if they were a popular professor, you got in line. And you would wait and sit on the floor for an hour and a half, 2 hours, and hopefully they would get to you before your time ran out and you had to go to the next thing. This also, what this really meant was you had time to talk to your fellow students for 2 hours, and people taking the same class. It was actually a very good sort of informal seminars could develop out in the hallway. So his office was cluttered, but neat, but very full. Had another person in it, Joel Silby, who would also listen while you were talking. It was clear that Joel would listen to while you were talking to Walt. Joel would listen, pretending he wasn't listening, but he likes history too. So I'm sure they critiqued every student when they left. So that's what I remember from his office.
Would he pitch in at all, Professor Silby?
I don't remember. I could make an argument for either case.
Yeah.
I think certainly I can imagine a world where he was a 19th century specialist. If I was doing a 19th century topic, I'm sure it would have been a three-way conversation, because he was very open, very good with students, very famous in his own right, as a mentor and a teacher. But I don't recall him jumping in to our conversations.
And we've heard a number of other people have mentioned the line outside the office.
Yeah.
Which is funny. So how have you interacted with LaFeber's work over the years? So this could be, your own research, writing, conferences, what have you.
I kind of wish we weren't taping this part, but we should. This is a little awkward because I think I begin my classes and begin my own thinking of American foreign policy at the beginning of the 20th century with some combination of LaFeber and Tom McCormick as having essentially a very new left revisionist interpretation. I've moved away from that. I think that's still useful for the 1890s and early 1900s. I don't use that thought process and methodology. I'm not as convinced as William Epps Williams or an early LaFeber was in the influence of economic determinism and as a factor in U.S. foreign policy making. That's not how I think anymore. So I actually have not really used a lot of, well, with one exception, I have not used a lot of Walt's individual monographs in my own writing after The New Empire, which was, of course, his first one. Having said that, I just remembered when I'm teaching, I use his stuff every day because his textbook on U.S. foreign policy, The American Age, is astoundingly good. So when I need a textbooky answer, I'm sure Walt, I can say to myself, I bet Walt was asking a similar question to what I'm wondering. And almost invariably, there's something in his book for that. So it's really helped me with my teaching. But I don't think my research necessarily reflects his influence as much as one might think.
But I think another way to think about that question could be, how did his work, his teaching style, influence you as a historian, as a professor too?
Oh, well, as a professor, I think he was the greatest influence of all. I still use that method I described earlier of when a student comes in, especially an undergraduate, and says, I want to work on something, I'll talk to them and assign them some stuff and say, read this and come back, and 95% of the time don't. But it seems like a good method. And the real secret to the method, I think, is that you present openness to everybody, because you never know who is actually good or bad, who's a diamond in the rough, who is actually overpolished in some ways, and who's really an interesting person until the second conversation, if you will. I actually we're having this conversation in my office, and I keep some of his books and paraphernalia from him in line of sight from my chair behind the students, so that if I am tired or if I am frustrated or if I am bored with this conversation, I will often look and say, Walt would like me to pay better attention. Walt would like me to listen to this person more. So his style of engaging and treating everyone with respect, at least initially, I think has really been the foundation of my entire approach to dealing with students.
What is that, at least initially?
Oh, I'm sure I mean, he got involved in scholarly debates as much as anybody.
Yeah.
There are people over time, I'm sure he decided, were not worth listening to. But
Right.
it wasn't the first conversation.
So, how do you think LaFeber himself viewed his contributions to the field of U.S. foreign relations? Asked differently, what do you think LaFeber considered his most important intellectual questions or themes?
So I'm actually going to punt on that question because, again, I knew him at the very tail end of his career. So many of the other people that we've interviewed had enough years after working with him that they could transition kind of into peer conversations and friend conversations and de facto members of the family conversations. I never had that opportunity. I mean, he stayed as a sort of a distant grandfather to me, but a grandfather. He would send letters. I should talk about some of those actually. He would send letters back in the day when people actually sent letters. We would correspond back and forth, and it was always a pleasure to get his correspondence. I don't know how he had time to do it. But I didn't know enough about him as a human being to be able to answer that question because he never, for me, transitioned out of the advisor role.
Let's talk about that role a little bit more then. So you took his class officially, and then did this sort of independent study with him. What happened after that? How did your relationship evolve?
So, as part of the chronology really matters here. As part of his transitioning to a different phase of his career, whatever we want to call that, semi-retirement, semi-teaching, I don't know what they called it, what he preferred. Cornell had gone ahead that year and hired a brand new assistant professor in diplomatic history, Tim Borstelman. And in the semesters that Walt was officially not teaching, Tim would be my official advisor. So, and I remained very close with Tim too. Different roles, different people. He didn't play. Tim is a wonderful guy, but he's played more of a peer role with me because our ages are much closer, obviously. You could say I had co-advisors in that sense, but in every instance, Tim did whatever Walt said he should do. And Walt was still coming to the office. It wasn't like Walt was a ghost. It just wasn't officially signing papers that semester. Tim taught the second semester U.S. Foreign Policy course. And then that summer after sophomore year, I did this intense research project with Walt. I was working during the day as a tour guide on campus and then spending the rest of my time working on this project. And I wrote this big paper, which I'm sure looking back now, if I read it today, I would say is terribly naive. And I believe at that point, at the start of my junior year, I already knew and had been talking to him about what I was going to do my senior thesis on. By the way, it was not every history major did a thesis. You had to be in the honors program, and I forget exactly how one, but not the honors. It wasn't a college-wide program. You had to try for departmental honors, I guess, which meant that you took a particular seminar with Michael Kamen, which was the most terrifying seminar anybody has ever taken ever. Happy to talk about that. That's actually a good example, not to segue, but that's a good example of his work as an advisor. I was going to go abroad, so most people took that course during their junior year, if I recall correctly. And I wanted to take it my junior year before I went abroad to study in England for a semester. And Walt said, "Who's teaching it this semester?" And I looked down the list and I said who it is. And he said, "Oh, it's not Kamen? No, you're not taking that this semester. You take it when you come back." He was very, very clear about the fact that the topic mattered less than the professor for what people were going to learn. So I don't know if it was just me, I think it was probably many of his students, really focused on making us take literature courses. And he would go down the list and tell me who I was going to take that semester without looking at what the topic was. It was whoever the professor was. So during my junior year, we worked on this topic, and I may have even done another independent study. And then I went abroad, and we kept in touch. But I was doing a lot of research at the British Archive while I was in England on my thesis, And then when I came back senior year is when we started full bore on the thesis writing, and that was really I want to say this. How do I say this? That was really a big deal. There were 5 people my year who did history honors. It was not a small undertaking, and not one that most people undertook. So what that meant for the purpose of our discussion here is I saw a lot of Walt because, it was a central part of my life, and I'm an undergraduate, so obviously I think I'm the center of the world. So I would pop in all the time.
Tell us a little bit about how you guys would keep in touch. You mentioned letters, and these are physical letters, just as a reminder.
Actual letters. Oh my God, I wish I had them, but I'm not good at keeping things. I'm trying to remember. It wasn't until I have no idea when my first email with Walt was. He eventually transitioned to email, but it was much later than anyone else I knew. And he may have been using email with other people, but it was so nice to actually, it was kind of like getting a letter from my grandma, who also used to write actual letters. It was such a wonderful thing that people today don't ever experience ever again, of getting an actual physical thing in the mail that someone put some time into and thought into. And I immediately left college and went to graduate school. That was not the original plan, but because of some funding issues with graduate school, they basically said, if you come now, you'll get some funding. If you come later, you won't. So I guess I'm coming now. So I was in graduate school a little bit earlier than I anticipated, and I was working with Tom McCormick, who he told me to work with. It was his close friend and fellow student at Wisconsin. And when I had issues, whatever they were, I would write and update him on what was going on, and then usually it was a question or two, and then he would write back with very, very little about himself, and then addressing whatever the question was. And I'll give you the best example, which was my first year in graduate school was when the O.J. Simpson trial occurred. And in fact, I used to joke that I would have been a great O.J. juror, because I was overseas during the white Bronco chase and during the first month. So I had and this is, before international TV really, I had no idea what had happened. I would have been a great juror. They didn't pick me. So when that verdict came out, I was very, very upset, because I interpreted it at the time, this is not how I would interpret it today, but I interpreted at the time that this was just an example of legal sophistry, that he had really smart, good lawyers, and good lawyers can manipulate anything, and that our society is clearly run by lawyers. I mean, now I know it's run by bankers. And so I pondered whether or not I should go to law school concurrently with my PhD. Wisconsin had a cooperative program, I think, with the University of Chicago. And I remember writing this to Walt, and he wrote back and said, no. He said, listen, doing multiple things at the same time rarely works out well. He said, I know you're doing very well in graduate school. Tom tells me you're doing very well in graduate school. But remember, doing well in graduate school courses is not the same as actually doing well in graduate school. That the syllabus is a starting point. So if you think you have the time to go to law school, better you should spend your time doing what you're doing well. And I imagine in the back of his mind, maybe in the front of his mind, he knew that this was just the kind of thing that 23-year-old Jeff would rail about and forget about 6 months later, and he was right.
Several participants in these interviews have noted that LaFeber would not have enjoyed being labeled a scholar activist, yet many people call him that. How do you think he might have viewed this label, describing his work?
I don't know that I knew him personally as a person well enough to really answer that question. Remind me, I need to tell you a story about 9/11. I don't know the answer to that question. I know that he was called upon a lot during the Panama discussion whether or not the U.S. was going to give back the Panama Canal, and also because of his work on Central America, that was obviously a key point in American foreign policy at the time. But I don't know, I really don't know how he approached that. I'm sorry to punt on that question, but I don't know the answer.
That's fine. So. Tell us the 9/11 story.
So let's see, I went to the University of Wisconsin for graduate school and spent 3 years in Madison, and then went back to Europe to do dissertation research, and then moved to Washington, and I worked at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum for a few years while working on my dissertation. And at that moment, I got my first real break, which was getting a postdoctoral fellowship at Yale, which, by the way, required me to finish my dissertation in like 3 months, and I had maybe 10 pages written before. It was a fun 3 months. We also got married during that time and moved. It was a fun 3 months. And the program I went to at Yale was the International Security Studies program, which was just developing their grand strategy subprogram. It was run cooperatively by John Gaddis, famous Cold War historian, and Paul Kennedy, famous British historian of strategy. The year I was selected, let me back up to say, John Gaddis had a long-standing animosity towards people from Wisconsin and the New Left and revisionists, and his entire initial work was called the post-revisionist thesis, because he thought we need to move past these simple people. And that animosity, scholarly animosity, I don't think it was ever personal that I know of. I'm sure there were personality conflicts just because human beings have personality conflicts, but this was an intellectual debate. But the field had developed into schools, if you will. And let's just say Gaddis was the head of one school, and LaFeber and McCormick and Gardner were in the other school. So, long story, sorry. The semester I got when I first started at Yale, the semester that the selection was made in the competition that I got the fellowship in, John was teaching at Oxford for the year as the Harmsworth professor. And that meant that Paul Kennedy is actually the one who hired me, or gave me the fellowship. And therefore, when I got to campus, September of 2001, I said, I need to introduce myself to this John Gaddis person I've never met, read all his books. And he was very nice, took me out to lunch, went to Maury's. And John had a very dry way of talking. And he said, tell me who made a mistake and let someone from Wisconsin into my program. And he said it with a very straight, serious face. I think today I would have laughed, but I didn't laugh. I thought, oh my God, I'm toast. Like, what does this mean? What the hell is it? So I got in my car maybe 2 days later and drove to Ithaca to seek Walt's counsel. We sat in his backyard, and he told me not to worry about this. That do good work and everything will turn out fine. I don't even remember this was maybe that part of the conversation was maybe 5 minutes. But then here's the funny part: we spent a very nice few hours in his backyard, talking about the state of the world. George W. Bush was still in his first months in office, and we concluded as two brilliant, thoughtful, sage scholars of American foreign policy that the key issue over the next several years was going to be how to deal with anti-ballistic missile defense and China. That was September 9th of 2001. Needless to say, we were wrong. So.
Do you recall conversing with him in the days after that?
I don't. I don't. I will say, how do I want to put this? Being a postdoc in particular, which means having time to think and to read and to explore new things, immediately after 9/11 and being at a security studies institute, not a history place, but security studies, that was so close to New York that people from the UN would come up all the time for dinner was undoubtedly the most intellectually invigorating experience. I mean, we were all scared to death, genuinely. I had friends in New York, and I remember, going in, and it was the first time I'd ever seen soldiers on the streets with guns, and this is America. That's not supposed to happen. Well, now it's relatively commonplace. So we were scared to death, but it was really intellectually invigorating. So much so that I did not do any work on transforming my dissertation into a book until maybe the last 2 weeks of my 2-year fellowship. But I wrote a ton. There was a ton to do. We all learned a whole different literature on the world. But my point being, we were all very, very, very active and engaged. And if I discuss those events with Walt, I don't remember it.
We're concluding here. So what impact do you see that LaFeber and his work have made in the discipline of history and beyond, whether it's the community of his students and the sort of ripple effect outwards?
Yeah, I think that's what I would, from my sense, focus on. So I'm not very good at historiography. In fact, I don't think historiographically. Some people do. My wife does. I don't. So I'm really not a great person to tell you what the impact that he had on history is, because I'm not really good at following trends in that direction. I know his interpretation of American foreign policy, especially at the beginning of the 20th century, at least to my mind, still remains the dominant, useful one. That was what his first book was on. And I don't know, aside from the fact that his books on the American age and America, Russia, and the Cold War each became the predominant textbooks, first for foreign policy and second for the Cold War, clearly that was a great influence on thinking and influence on the field, though one might argue more on undergraduates than on graduate students. And as I said earlier, I don't think I really fit the mold of a LaFeber student in terms of my writings. But the impact that he had inserting what I think is best described as thoughtful niceness into the academy cannot be understated. Not every professor actually cares about their students, and not every professor actually wants to be nice. And by example, he demonstrated that you can be a successful scholar without being a jerk. And it is disturbing how rare that is. And I don't know, I can only think of a few people that I know of that work closely with Walt who I would subsequently describe as jerks. And one I'm thinking of particular, I'm not going to name. One I'm thinking of particular, I noted at one point that this person was really a jerk, probably use worse words than that, and she had studied with Walt. How is that possible? And I discovered subsequently that the two of them had never spoken after her graduation, that clearly they did not meld well, or she wasn't interested in his advice. So I'm sure he was capable of governing or supervising unnice people, but the people who stuck around followed his example, and I think that there's not a class that goes by that I've ever taught, or a day that goes by that I'm interacting with students, where I don't think Walt's influence of caring and concern isn't present.
I have one more question before I will invite you to add anything else, which is something I meant to ask earlier. What did a letter from Walt LaFeber look like? What was his handwriting like, if you can recall?
He typed them.
Okay.
He typed them, and then there's usually like a little scrawl or PS at the bottom. They were single-spaced. They were very full. And I think he probably put his, I remember for some reason, I remember that it was on Cornell, in a Cornell envelope, but he wrote LaFeber in the corner, I suspect for accounting purposes. It was very full. And again, I think I might be the youngest person that we're interviewing for this project. He didn't talk about himself in these lectures, in these conversations, and in these letters. You know, I was always a 23-year-old to him, as far as I could tell. And I am sure let me say this way. I like to think he was proud of me. I never heard from Walt praise, unvarnished praise, you know, in the sense that, you know, I sent him my books, and I remember one time in particular I got a teaching award, and I sent him a picture of myself getting the teaching award and said, "This is because of you," you know, and he was very complimentary, very, you know, congratulations, that kind of thing. As far as I know, he thought my stuff sucked. I have no idea. He never talked about those kinds of things with me, and I never asked. Why do I say that? What was the question?
Well,
Sorry.
no, you've made me think of another question. That was, you know, you're 23, you're getting these letters from this professor who, by this point, you understand that he's a big deal.
Yeah.
What did that mean to you? I mean, that must have been, must have made an impression.
Well, I am shocked looking back now that he had time to do that. Though you remind me of something really important, which is that Walt had a little office in Olin Library that overlooked the quad. Really nice place. And it's important to note, this could not exist anymore because this study didn't have a computer and didn't have a phone. And I presume if Sandy wanted to talk to him, she had to call the desk, and they would send a student up saying, "Call your wife." I can't imagine that kind of isolation today, and that kind of isolated time. So when I think, how did Walt possibly have time to write these letters, I'm reminded that I spend 3 hours a day writing emails, and he never did, as far as I could tell, professionally. You know, what did it mean to get a letter from Walt and to be it felt really good. You know, it felt like you had somebody who was going to protect you, have your back, if you ever needed it. And I remember, you know, being at a conference, I think maybe my first or second Schaefer conference, and he invited me to sit next to him over lunch. And could you imagine? I mean, that's like sitting next to the queen of the prom, right? I mean, everybody looked and said, "Who is this person we've never seen before who's sitting next to LaFeber and talking like they know each other?" I guess in my happier thoughts, perhaps that suggests that he recognized something in me he wanted to cultivate, or that he wanted to respond to. But more important to me was that this extremely important person was taking the time to talk to me and to guide me, and never said no to a request for more time. I think everybody should have that mentorship in their lives. I think mentors are actually extraordinarily important, and I can say that with the privilege of having a series of incredible mentors, him being the first.
I think that's a good note to end on. Is there anything else? I know that we could probably talk about him all day, but anything else you feel like you want to add right now?
Two quick anecdotes. The first is, I think the funniest thing I've ever seen a professor say in my entire life is when it was the last moments of his foreign policy lecture class, 1750 to 1913. And everybody's already described to you how, you know, his lectures were astounding, and There was no pauses. There was no ums. They were scripted without notes. It was just an absolutely, I've never seen to this day a better lecturer. I might be a better lecturer, but that's besides the point. And I do remember him actually, I actually asked him once, why did you lecture that way? And he said, well, it's because of Sandy. Sandy said to him early on in his career, if you're going to be successful, you need to learn to do this without notes because it looks better. And I try to tell my graduate students that too. So it's the end of this, figure if there was, 3 lectures a week at that point, and they were, let's say 2 lectures a week, let's say 25, 30 hours of lecturing with no space for questions. I mean, he starts on time and he ends on time. With 30 seconds to go at the end of the semester, he says essentially, and there you have a history of American foreign relations from 1750 to 1913. Any questions? I really want somebody to raise their hand and say, yes, in lecture 4. So that's the first funny thing. The second funny thing is I have very warm memories actually of the few moments that I saw him and Sandy interact. And I think in some ways they demonstrated, even to me at a young age, that this is the respect that a couple should have for each other. I remember one time we had a big event. He had a big event at his house. There was a couple of Congress people that came up to talk, and he invited people over to his house to talk to them. And we had food and probably lasagna. And she was, in the kitchen and was cleaning up, and she clearly was tired and exasperated, and like any human being would be. And I remember just sort of, I wasn't stalking them, but I was walking by and looked in the kitchen. I saw, he was rubbing her back a little bit. I thought that's a nice couple. But another time, I was in his kitchen and he served me. It was late afternoon in Ithaca, but I only remember that because it was dark. But in Ithaca it gets dark around 2:00, and he served me vichyssoise. And when Sandy got home, she scolded him quite dramatically in front of me because he had given me a bowl with a chip in it. And she said, how can you give this person a bowl with a chip in it? And I think he rightly said, we use those bowls. What's the problem here? So I love that story.
How was the soup?
I don't think I'm a vichyssoise fan, but in fact, I may not even have ever had it before, but it was good. Oh my God, I just have another story. I'm sorry.
Let's hear it.
I know you guys have a life and have things to do. I'll try to make this short. My roommate and closest friend in the world and best man at my wedding went into the restaurant industry, and he wound up working for a while at one of the fanciest, most prestigious restaurants in Manhattan. And he called me up at some point and said, I was just looking at the reservation book, and LaFeber's coming in for lunch with some other people, table for 4. And Ron, of his own volition, sent out all kinds of freebies, all kinds of free food, and said, these are from Jeff, these are from Jeff, these are from Jeff. And he wrote me the very nicest letter afterwards saying, I've contacted the registrar and have decided to retroactively raise all your grades. The really funny part is that Ron told me subsequently that he had never seen a group of people eat faster, the free stuff. It was really good. They liked it.
I love that. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. This was fun.
I'm really
sorry
wonderful.
to have it end. Thank you guys for doing just an amazing job on this project.
Of course.